So it turns out going from an insurgency to governing a country is tough. I mean, who'd have thunk it? Anyways, in Afghanistan, the Taliban are sort of building that plane right now, in flight, while under fire, and probably missing a few key parts. Meanwhile, the rest of the world seemingly doesn't really care, and for the most part are just standing by as the country is pulled in different directions by multiple groups fighting for control. As an example, on September 2nd, 2024, a suicide bombing was carried out in Kabul targeting a Taliban government building. The Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP, claimed responsibility for the attack, which killed 6 Afghans and wounded 13 others. ISKP stated that this attack was in retaliation for the treatment of Muslim prisoners held by the Taliban. I know this is complicated and I'll get into more detail here in a moment, but as an overview, ISKP doesn't get along with anyone, like at all, 0 allies. The Taliban are allied with Al-Qaeda and don't like ISKP or the National Resistance Front, NRF. NRF is primarily focused on fighting the Taliban and ISKP, with Al-Qaeda sort of a secondary target. Al-Qaeda then is, well, actually kind of the same as the Taliban in this case. In fact, a lot of Taliban leadership moonlight these days as key Al-Qaeda figures, but we'll get into more of those groups in detail here in a moment. Now, following this attack, the National Resistance Front, or NRF, the primary armed opposition to the Taliban's rule, issued a statement criticizing the Taliban's ability to provide safety and security for the people of Afghanistan. The NRF highlighted the Taliban's failure to protect civilians from escalating violence, including attacks by extremist groups like, in this case, ISKP. The NRF emphasized that under Taliban rule, Afghanistan had witnessed a surge in insecurity with increasing incidents of targeted killings, bombings, as well as human rights violations. Finally, they used this time to call for a unified national resistance to restore peace and stability, advocating for an inclusive government that respects the rights of all Afghans. Of course, the Taliban wasn't just going to sit by and allow this threat to their control to fester, so immediately following the attack, they intensified security operations to counter ISKP and other insurgent threats, including the NRF. The Taliban increased patrols in major cities, conducted targeted raids leading to arrests of suspected ISKP affiliates, and enhanced intelligence operations using local informants to track insurgent activities. However, despite these efforts, ISKP continued to launch attacks against minority communities, and meanwhile, the NRF struck even more Taliban targets, attacks that we'll get into more detail here in just a moment. And all of this further highlighted the fact that the Taliban does not have control in Afghanistan. So a fun fact about me, did you know I almost named my dog after our strong point in Afghanistan? This here is Strong Point Zarvkel down in Kandahar, and this is Cole, who's probably grateful that my brother came up with a better name back in 2013. So my buddy Colt was born in Kentucky, and I got him when I was in Tennessee. We then moved to Michigan, Illinois, Texas, and now back to Tennessee. So yeah, he's kind of well-traveled. Now, by the second move, we noticed that he was having a bit of a skin reaction. It could have been the new environment, new allergens in the air, who knows, but right away we decided to focus in on his diet to make sure he was getting all of the nutrition he needed and none of the junk. Turns out that was it. He just needed a better quality food, and my buddy Colt is still going strong and coming up on his 12th birthday now. So if you want to make the same move for your family's best friend, check out Sundays for Dogs. Sundays is made from entirely human-grade ingredients and is air-dried, similar to how beef jerky is made, for instance. The company was actually founded by a veterinarian and her husband who wanted a better option than kibble that was both easy and healthy. Sundays is running one of their biggest sales of the year for Black Friday and Cyber Monday. 60% off from now until December 8th. To take advantage of that deal, go to the link in the description or use code Preston at checkout. Now, it's been a while, to say the least, since there was a long-term peace in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded, resulting in a devastating war with the US-backed Mujahideen fighters who eventually forced the Soviets to withdraw in 1989. A brutal civil war followed, and by 1996, the Taliban was firmly in control of the country. Then, after the 9/11 attacks, a US-led invasion ousted the Taliban, sparking a 20-year conflict as the Taliban waged an insurgency against Afghan and NATO forces. The U.S. withdrawal in 2021 then allowed the Taliban to retake control, but they now face internal and external threats from resistance forces and extremist groups like the Islamic State Khorasan Province. On that note, we should do a quick introduction here of a few key groups currently vying for some degree of control in Afghanistan. First, of course, we have the Taliban, who emerged in the early 1990s as an Islamist militant group largely made up of students from religious schools. They were students, or talibs. Yep, that's where the name comes from. The more you know. Anyways, the Taliban promised to restore order amid the chaos of Afghanistan's ongoing civil war, and by 1996, they'd seized control of Kabul and established a regime characterized by strict Sharia law, which imposed severe restrictions on women, limited civil liberties, and suppressed ethnic minorities. But nobody outside of Afghanistan, at least in the West, really cared, all things considered. That is until Al-Qaeda used Afghanistan to base out of to conduct the 9/11 attacks. So following those attacks, the US-led coalition invaded Afghanistan in 2001, ousting the Taliban for harboring Al-Qaeda, and over the next 20 years, the Taliban led an insurgency against Afghan and NATO forces, regaining ground in rural areas and building a shadow government that eventually enabled their comeback. And that's actually an important piece that I think is often overlooked. The Taliban never went away. At times they were down, but certainly never out. And in quite a few areas of the country, they maintained this shadow-type government where locals could choose to go with them or the official local Afghan authorities to meet out their differences. Of course, when U.S. coalition and eventually Afghan military presence was reduced, we saw these organizations step out from the shadows, all set to take action locally, regionally, or nationally. Now, today, the Taliban currently control Afghanistan, having taken power swiftly in 2021 following the U.S. and NATO withdrawal. They now face the challenge of governing a nation plagued by economic hardship, humanitarian crisis, and limited international recognition. Since their takeover, the Taliban have reestablished strict Islamic law, significantly restricting women's rights by banning them from secondary education in many workplaces and enforcing conservative dress codes and movement restrictions. Internationally, the Taliban are largely isolated, facing sanctions that worsen Afghanistan's economic situation, while aid organizations work to prevent humanitarian disaster amid worsening poverty and food insecurity. In this complex setting, the Taliban's control remains tenuous as they navigate internal divisions, insurgent threats, and a population that continues to bear the brunt of decades of conflict. Now, shifting over to another group here, the National Resistance Front, or NRF. This group is the primary organized opposition to the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan. They were formed in 2021, mostly operate out of the Panjshir Valley, and are currently led by Ahmad Massoud, son of the famous anti-Taliban resistance leader Ahmad Shah Massoud. The NRF includes former Afghan military personnel, local fighters, and ethnic leaders, all opposed to Taliban rule. And despite facing an uphill battle against the Taliban's superior numbers and resources, the NRF has engaged in guerrilla warfare, staging attacks and ambushes to challenge Taliban forces in multiple areas of the country. So instead of the US and NATO fighting back a Taliban insurgency, today the Taliban are fighting back an NRF insurgency. The fight right now is nothing like we saw when the Soviets were defeated in the 80s and Charlie Wilson and the CIA armed and funded a bunch of mujahideen groups. As of now, it doesn't appear the NRF has any significant international support. Their actions, capabilities, and strength don't really indicate any major external actors being involved. Today, this is very much a local grassroots effort to fight back against the Taliban. Now moving on to ISKP, or Islamic State Khorasan Province. This is an extremist militant group that emerged in Afghanistan in 2015 as a branch of ISIS. Their stated goal is to establish an Islamic caliphate in the Khorasan region, which historically includes Afghanistan and surrounding areas. ISKP pretty quickly distinguished themselves as a rival to the Taliban, denouncing the Taliban as insufficiently strict in their interpretation of Islamic law. So just to get it out of the way there, the Taliban and ISKP are not friends. They are fighting an ongoing war against each other. In fact, there was actually a short stretch between 2015 and the U.S. withdrawal in 2021 where you could loosely argue that the U.S. and the Taliban were on the same side in this fight. And there's no evidence that there was any direct communication or coordination at the time, but as the U.S. hunted down and killed ISKP fighters in the eastern portion of the country, that was, in a sense, sort of a benefit to the Taliban. It's a messy world. Now, ISKP has carried out brutal attacks targeting both Taliban and civilian sites, particularly Shiite Muslim communities and other minorities, in an effort to destabilize Taliban control and possibly provoke sectarian violence. And since the Taliban's return to power in 2021, ISKP has intensified its operations, launching high-profile attacks in Kabul and other urban centers, which highlight, again, the Taliban's inability to ensure security. Now, while ISKP remains quite a bit smaller than the Taliban, its violent tactics and targeting of civilian gatherings, mosques, and foreign entities make it a persistent and destabilizing force in Afghanistan. It is truly a terrorist organization carrying out terrorist-style attacks against the civilian population, which is never easy to deal with. I've actually heard some accounts of Taliban fighters joining ISKP because they'd rather be in kind of like the upstart group, fighting back against those in power, then turn into some sort of low-level bureaucrat in the Taliban government, which is kind of weird when you think about it, but it also, in a lot of ways, makes sense. Finally, we have Al-Qaeda. Remember them? They never went away either. So Al-Qaeda still retains a presence in Afghanistan, or more accurately, has reestablished a presence there. By and large, Al-Qaeda was not operating in Afghanistan after roughly 2002. Yes, there were still camps and operatives scattered across the country, but it's just too risky for them to be in an area where U.S. forces or drone strikes could show up at any moment. However, when the U.S. withdrew in 2021, quite a few key figures are believed to have come right back, which is interesting because while the Taliban pledged in 2020 to prevent Al-Qaeda from using Afghanistan as a platform for international terrorism, ties between those two groups remain evident and are pretty clear in a lot of ways. Now, after the September suicide bombing attack in Kabul, ISKP carried out several significant attacks across Afghanistan. In early October, ISKP targeted Taliban forces in Panjshir province, followed by an attack on a sports center in a Shia Hazara area of Kabul. Additional attacks in Baghlan targeted Shia worshippers at a mosque, while mid-October saw ISKP ambushing Taliban patrols in Kunar province. And while all of this fighting is taking center stage, behind the scenes, reports indicate a re-emergence of al-Qaeda training camps across the country. These camps, believed to be situated in remote and rugged areas, particularly in eastern and southern Afghanistan, mark a resurgence of al-Qaeda's presence following years of counterterrorism efforts that had previously pretty well diminished their footprint. In fact, al-Qaeda has reportedly leveraged its historical ties to the Taliban and exploited the current instability, surprise, surprise, to train new recruits and strengthen regional networks in and around Afghanistan. I mean, this shouldn't be too much of a shock. The leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was killed by a U.S. drone strike in Kabul in 2022, and to put it lightly, he wasn't there on accident. I mean, clearly some Taliban leaders knew of his travel to and stay in their country. He's just way too high-profile a person to go under the Taliban's radar. In fact, on that note, there's actually a rumor that Zawahiri was escorted in without overall Taliban control, and that his presence may have been withheld from certain leaders. But either way, you don't just enter Afghanistan in 2021, 2022 and move into a Kabul safe house without significant Taliban support. On top of that, there are a handful of key Taliban leaders with known al-Qaeda affiliation, so in many cases, right now at least, the Taliban and al-Qaeda can be viewed as one and the same. For instance, Qari Baryal, the governor of Kabul province, was described by U.S. military as an al-Qaeda-affiliated Taliban leader while he ran the Kabul Attack Network. That was a group that carried out countless suicide attacks against U.S., Afghan, and coalition forces with the alleged assistance of al-Qaeda operatives. Then, of course, we have Sirajuddin Haqqani, the acting Minister of Interior. This is the leader of the Haqqani network who has close ties with al-Qaeda dating back to the 1980s. In fact, whenever a senior al-Qaeda figure was killed by a U.S. drone strike in Pakistan over the last 20 years, a good chunk of the time they were alongside members of the Haqqani network, who were in some ways providing shelter and safe passage to these al-Qaeda operatives. There was also a 2021 United Nations report that noted that Sirajuddin is assessed to be a member of al-Qaeda's wider leadership. So more than just associated with the group, there are legitimate assessments that he's a formal member of al-Qaeda. Now, we could go on for a while here, but it's just worth noting the Taliban and al-Qaeda are more intertwined now than ever, so hearing that some al-Qaeda camps are popping up across the country certainly passes the common sense test, unfortunately. Now, amidst all of this turmoil, the National Resistance Front, or NRF, recently conducted multiple operations against the Taliban. On October 18th, the NRF claimed responsibility for an attack in Kabul's 8th district, targeting Taliban intelligence agents. The operation reportedly resulted in the deaths of 3 Taliban members, with NRF forces seizing Taliban weapons while sustaining 0 casualties. Then on October 24th, the NRF reported an assault on a Taliban base in Panjshir, leading to the death of 13 Taliban fighters, marking one of their more significant attacks against the Taliban in recent months. And these were just the big ones from October. Throughout the month, NRF intensified its efforts, claiming responsibility for a series of attacks that did produce Taliban casualties, especially in the north and northeastern provinces. In fact, to date, the NRF says they carried out more than 200 operations in 2024 with the goal of highlighting their ability to stay in the fight long-term against the Taliban rule. Additionally, a second armed resistance group known as the Afghanistan Freedom Front, or AFF, which is led by former Afghan Army General Yasin Zia, has become increasingly emboldened in recent weeks. In the last 2 weeks alone, the AFF has carried out more than 15 attacks on the Taliban across 7 provinces, including an attack on a military compound in Faryab province that killed 2 Taliban fighters and a rocket attack on the military section of the Kabul airport. The AFF also attacked the Taliban's interior ministry in Kabul on October 18th, killing 4 Taliban fighters and issuing a statement saying that it was, quote, shattering the false illusion of the Taliban's security. Now, the AFF is also cooperating with the National Resistance Front, and by all accounts, the confidence of these movements is growing. I mean, the AFF used the 3rd anniversary of the Taliban's return to power just a couple months ago to call for, quote, better unity, cohesion, and alignment among all anti-Taliban groups. And then veteran warlord Abdul Rashid Dostum recently called for a government in exile to overthrow the Taliban with the backing of the international community. Now, in response to intensified operations by the National Resistance Front, the Taliban has ramped up military and police measures to suppress the resistance. They've launched targeted offensives, particularly in NRF strongholds in the Panjshir Valley, deploying additional troops and conducting search and clear missions to dismantle NRF networks. According to a new article in Asia Times, they say, quote, the Taliban leadership is responding to these increased threats by doubling down on its brutality. The Taliban has created new societal tensions with its recent edict banning images of living things. Videos and photos on television, computers and mobile phones are forbidden, with media companies now forced to run audio-only TV programs. This comes after the Taliban outlawed music last year. Taliban continues to target journalists and civil society, arresting and detaining 141 journalists since 2021, according to Reporters Without Borders. This includes arresting 3 radio journalists in Khost Province for broadcasting music and receiving calls from female listeners. Amnesty International stated that civil society has been, quote, shattered under the Taliban. They wrap up by saying, for women, Taliban control over their lives is almost total, with almost all denied an education or jobs in most sectors. After banning women from beauty parlors and national parks, the Taliban has implemented a new morality law imposing severe restrictions on a woman's appearance, behavior, and movement, and has gone so far as to ban women from speaking publicly. Additionally, the Taliban has engaged in public messaging campaigns aimed at undermining the NRF's credibility by portraying them as destabilizing elements, while emphasizing their own role in maintaining national unity and security. But messaging alone isn't going to stop attacks, and ISKP and the NRF aren't slowing down. On October 18th, ISKP detonated an IED in Kabul, killing 3 Taliban fighters. A few days later, on the 20th, they attacked a checkpoint in Ghor Province, killing 2 Taliban members and seizing their weapons. Then on the 24th, they ambushed a Taliban patrol in Kunar, killing 4 fighters and destroying 2 vehicles. And with the Taliban putting so much time and energy into stabilizing the security situation, that's allowed their guests, Al-Qaeda, to expand their influence across the country. While the Taliban grapples with both domestic insurgency and the demands of governance, Al-Qaeda's resilience has grown, giving it opportunities to coordinate with regional jihadi groups, train fighters, and strengthen its infrastructure, positioning itself for a potential resurgence on both the local and international scene. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, the past seems doomed to repeat itself. Multiple armed groups are vying for control while the world largely sits by and watches. As someone who spent nearly 2 years in Afghanistan, I know I speak for a lot of my brothers and sisters in arms when I say I truly hope the Afghan people can find peace. I wish we could have done that for you. We couldn't, or we wouldn't. I'm still not exactly sure which it was, but either way, let's not lose focus of what's happening in that country. There are still a lot of wonderful Afghan people that are today trapped in the middle of an ongoing war. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.